The House He Left Me. An original story. My name is Ethan Reyes, and 3 days after I buried my husband, his mother handed me a garbage bag full of my clothes and told me the house was never mine to begin with. I want to tell you what happened after that, because it isn't the story she wanted people to hear, and it isn't the story I expected either. Daniel and I met when we were 22, at a community college night class neither of us actually needed, sitting next to each other because it was the only seat left in the front row. He drew stars in the margins of his notebook instead of taking notes, and when I leaned over to ask what page we were on, he just slid the whole notebook toward me and said, "Take it. I wasn't using it for math anyway." We were together for 11 years. We got married 4 of those years in his sister's backyard, with string lights and a borrowed sound system, and his mother sitting in the second row with her arms crossed the entire ceremony. Carol never said she hated me. She was too careful for that. She said things like, "Well, you know how I was raised and I just want what's best for my son, and it's not that I don't love you, Ethan. It's that I don't understand this." Daniel used to squeeze my hand under the table when she said things like that, and afterward in the car, he'd apologize for her the way you apologize for weather. "She'll come around," he used to say. "She still calls me on my birthday." That has to count for something. I believed him, mostly because I wanted it to be true, and because loving someone means you inherit their hope along with everything else. We bought the house on Larkspur Street 6 years into the marriage. A small blue 2-bedroom with a crooked porch step Daniel kept meaning to fix and never did. It wasn't much, but it was ours. We painted the kitchen yellow because Daniel said a kitchen should feel like sunlight even when it's raining, and we never got around to painting the guest room, so it just stayed the color of an old bruise, half lavender, half gray, and we joked that we'd deal with it eventually. Eventually didn't come. Daniel died on a Tuesday in March, on his way home from his father's shop, when a truck ran a light on Hendricks Avenue. I was chopping onions for dinner when the police called, and for the rest of my life I will remember that I answered the phone still holding the knife, like some part of me knew I needed to put something down before I could hear what they were about to tell me. I don't remember most of the next few days. I remember Carol at the hospital, not looking at me, speaking only to the doctor, then to Daniel's father, then to her daughter, moving through the waiting room like I was a stranger who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I remember the funeral where she sat in the front pew with her family, and I sat 2 rows back with mine, because somewhere in the planning, without ever discussing it with me, she had decided where everyone belonged. I let it happen because I didn't have the strength to fight her over seating, not that week. I told myself grief makes people strange, and that she was allowed to be strange, and that I would deal with everything else once the fog lifted. The fog never really lifted. It just turned into something colder, and 3 days after the funeral, Carol let herself into the house with the spare key Daniel had given her years ago, back when we still thought that kindness would be returned in kind. I was in the guest room, the lavender gray one, going through a box of Daniel's college things, when I heard her moving around downstairs. By the time I came down, she had 2 garbage bags sitting by the front door, and I recognized my own shirts folded messily inside one of them. "Ethan," she said, in the same voice she used for talking to waiters who'd gotten her order wrong, "we need to talk about the house." I told her I didn't understand. She told me very simply that the house belonged to Daniel, and now that Daniel was gone, it belonged to the family, meaning her family, meaning not me, and that she thought it would be easier for everyone, especially me, if I found somewhere else to stay while the estate got sorted out. I said the house belonged to both of us. "We bought it together," I said. "My name is on the mortgage." She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're wrong and are simply waiting for you to catch up. "Sweetheart," she said, and the word landed like a slap. "You were never really family. I know Daniel loved you in his way, but blood is blood and property goes to blood. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you always knew this house was always more his than yours." I asked her if she had spoken to a lawyer. She said she didn't need to, that everyone knew how these things worked, and that she'd already spoken to her son-in-law, who did something with real estate, and he'd told her the same thing. I found out later that her son-in-law sold vacation timeshares, not property law, but in that moment I didn't know that, and I didn't have it in me to argue. I had buried my husband 4 days earlier. I had a garbage bag with my shirts in it sitting by the door of the house I'd painted yellow with him. And I had his mother standing in our kitchen, telling me I had never really belonged there, using the same calm, reasonable voice she'd used to ask if I wanted more coffee at every holiday dinner for 11 years. So I left. I took the 2 bags, I took my laptop, and I drove to the only place I could think to go, which was my friend Mara's apartment on the other side of town. Mara had been Daniel's friend first, actually, from high school, before she became mine too, and when I knocked on her door at 10 at night holding garbage bags like some kind of ghost, she didn't ask questions. She just stepped back and let me in and made up the couch and sat with me until I stopped shaking. I stayed on that couch for 6 weeks. I want to be honest about that period, because it wasn't dramatic in the way grief looks in movies. It was quiet and humiliating in a very specific way. I went to work most days because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I ate dinner sitting cross-legged on Mara's couch, watching shows I didn't follow because the silence was worse. I did not, for those 6 weeks, think about the will. Daniel and I had made one 3 years earlier, after a friend of ours, another gay man, had died suddenly, and his partner of 9 years had lost everything to a family that refused to acknowledge the relationship had ever existed. That story had scared us enough to finally sit down with a lawyer. I remembered signing papers. I remembered Daniel joking that he was leaving me his terrible taste in ties and nothing else. I did not remember the details, because at the time, it had felt like a formality, like buying insurance you hope you never need. It was Mara who finally said, 3 weeks after I moved in, "Don't you and Daniel have a will somewhere?" I hadn't thought of it, not really, because grief narrows your whole mind down to a hallway with no doors. But once she said it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I called the lawyer's office the next morning. Her name was Priya Anand, and she remembered us immediately, which surprised me, until she explained that she remembered every couple who came to her specifically because they were afraid of exactly what had just happened to me. She asked me to come in. She asked me to bring identification. And she told me, in a very careful, very measured voice, that Carol was not entitled to make any decisions about the house on Larkspur Street, because the house was never actually part of what people casually call the estate in the way Carol seemed to think. I didn't understand what that meant until I sat across from her desk 2 days later. Priya had the will in front of her, along with a second document I didn't recognize, a deed with both our names on it, filed under something called joint tenancy with right of survivorship. She explained it slowly, the way you'd explain something to someone who was still learning to trust good news. When 2 people own a house that way, she said, and one of them dies, the house doesn't go through probate at all. It doesn't go to whoever the will names. It passes directly and automatically to the surviving owner. It was never Daniel's house to leave to anyone, because the moment he died, it became entirely yours. It always would have. I sat there for a long moment, not fully able to process it. Carol had not made a mistake, exactly. She had simply never checked. She had assumed, the way people sometimes assume the world will rearrange itself to fit what they already believe, and no one had corrected her, possibly because no one in her family had thought to look, or possibly because part of her hadn't wanted to know. But there was more. Priya slid the will itself across the desk and asked if I wanted her to read it aloud or if I wanted to read it myself. I asked her to read it. Daniel had written a letter attached to the legal document, dated the same week we'd signed everything, 3 years earlier. Priya read it in her calm lawyer's voice, but even she paused once near the middle before continuing. I'm not going to repeat it word for word, because some things are private even in the telling, but I'll tell you what it said in my own words, because I've read it so many times since that it lives in me differently now than it did on paper. Daniel wrote that he loved his mother, and that he understood she came from a different time and a different fear, and that he didn't want anyone in his family punished for not being able to unlearn everything overnight. But he wrote that his home, the actual walls and floor and crooked porch step, belonged to the man he had chosen, the way you choose the person you build a life with, and that no discomfort his mother felt about that choice should ever be allowed to undo it. He wrote that if anyone in his family tried to take that home from me, it would mean they had understood nothing about him at all, and that would be its own kind of loss, worse than money. And then, near the end, he'd written something that broke me open in that office, in front of a lawyer I barely knew. He wrote, Ethan, if you're the one hearing this instead of me, I'm sorry I'm not there to say it in person. But you were never a guest in our life. You were half of it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, especially not out of grief, and especially not my mother, who loves harder than she knows how to show. I cried in that office for a long time. Priya let me. When I could talk again, I asked her what happened now, practically speaking. She told me the house was already legally mine, and had been from the moment Daniel died, whether or not Carol accepted that. She told me I could go back whenever I wanted. She also told me something else, almost as an afterthought, that turned out to matter more than I expected. Buried in the will, in a section about Daniel's small life insurance policy and his portion of his father's shop, was a paragraph naming a modest sum, not enormous, but not nothing, that Daniel had set aside specifically for his mother, described in his own words as, for whatever she needs, no conditions, because I don't want money to be one more thing she has to be afraid of losing. He had thought about her, even while making sure she couldn't take my home. That was Daniel completely. He held both things at once, love and boundaries, without ever treating them as opposites. I went back to the house on Larkspur Street the next day. I sat on the crooked porch step for a long time before I went inside, running my hand over the wood he'd always meant to fix. And for the first time since the funeral, the grief felt like something I could actually hold instead of something holding me. I changed the locks that afternoon, not out of spite, but because Priya advised it gently, and because I needed to know that the next time someone walked through that door, it would be because I let them. I did not hear from Carol for 2 weeks. When she finally called, it wasn't an apology, not really, not at first. It was her voice, tight and formal, asking if we could meet, because her lawyer, the actual lawyer this time, not her son-in-law, had reviewed the documents and told her plainly that there was nothing to contest, that the house had never been part of Daniel's estate to distribute, and that pursuing anything further would only cost her money she didn't have and dignity she'd already spent. I agreed to meet her because, despite everything, some part of me still remembered 11 years of birthday phone calls, and because Daniel's letter was sitting in my mind like a compass. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, the kind of place with too many plants and not enough chairs. Carol looked smaller than I remembered, and older, in a way grief does to people regardless of how they've behaved. She didn't apologize right away. She talked about Daniel as a boy, about a summer when he broke his arm trying to build a treehouse by himself because he didn't want to bother his father at the shop, about how stubborn he'd always been, how he never let anyone help him with anything unless he'd already decided to accept it on his own terms. "He picked you the same way," she said finally, not looking at me. "He didn't ask my permission. He just decided, and then he built a whole life around the decision, the way he built that treehouse, one board at a time, whether or not it made sense to anyone watching." I asked her carefully why she'd done what she did, the garbage bags, the locks, all of it. She was quiet for a long moment. "I was scared," she said. "Not of you. Of losing the last piece of him I thought I had left. I told myself the house was that piece. I told myself if I kept it, some part of him stayed with our family instead of just going wherever he went. I know that doesn't make it right. I know what I did to you. I just needed you to understand it wasn't really about you at all. It was about a mother who didn't know how to survive her own grief without breaking something." I didn't forgive her completely, not that day, and I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story about instant forgiveness. But I told her about the money Daniel had left her, the part she didn't know about, the part with no conditions attached, because I don't want money to be one more thing she has to be afraid of losing. She cried in a way I had genuinely never seen her cry before, not composed, not managed, just cried, right there among the too many plants. And for the first time in 11 years, I saw her simply as a person, not an obstacle, not a gatekeeper, just someone who had loved her son badly and imperfectly, and was now living in the wreckage of both that love and that failure. It's been a year now. Carol comes to the house sometimes, not often, but sometimes, and she sits on the porch step, the one still slightly crooked because some part of me can't bring myself to fix it, and we talk about Daniel in small, careful pieces, the way you'd hand someone something breakable. She has never fully said the word wrong about what she did, not outright, but she doesn't need to anymore, because I can see it in the way she asks about my life now. The way she remembers my birthday too, unprompted, the way she once told Mara, when she thought I wasn't listening, that she wished she'd learned to love out loud instead of sideways, before it was almost too late to learn at all. I used part of the money from Daniel's estate, the part that was legally mine and always had been, to start something small in his name, a scholarship fund at the community college where we met, for LGBTQ students studying trades, because Daniel always said his father's shop taught him more about patience than any classroom ever had, and because I liked the idea of some other 22-year-old sliding a notebook toward a stranger someday, without knowing yet what it might turn into. I painted the guest room this spring. Not yellow like the kitchen, but a soft, steady blue, the color of the house itself, the color of something built to last rather than something that just happened to us by accident. People sometimes ask me if I regret staying quiet for those 6 weeks on Mara's couch, if I regret not fighting Carol the moment she handed me those garbage bags. I don't, not really, because I think grief asks something different of everyone, and mine needed silence before it could ask for anything else. What I do know is this. Daniel spent 11 years loving me out loud, in a house he made sure could never be taken from me, and in a letter that reached me exactly when I needed it, saying the thing he never got the chance to say one more time in person. "You were never a guest in our life. You were half of it." I believe him.